Good afternoon, welcome to today's seminar. I get to introduce somebody who doesn't really need any introduction in this department. George Nicholas. Just briefly, for those of you maybe less familiar with George than the rest of us, George completed his bachelor's at Franklin Pierce College in New Hampshire in 1975.
We don't need dates.
We always need dates.
Followed by a master's at the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri, and you just said not do dates. I won't do dates. PhD, University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and then shortly thereafter moved to SFU. So this was actually in 1991 to the Kamloops campus. And then George moved across in 2005 to the main campus. Promoted to full professor the following year, and then he's obviously just taken over as a dictator, the chair of the department this year. George has very wide-ranging intellectual interests. His areas of specialisation are archaeological theory, intellectual property issues related to cultural heritage, indigenous archaeology, ecological archaeology, and particularly human ecology of wetlands, North American prehistory, with an emphasis on the northeast area and the Plateau region, prehistoric and contemporary human ecology, and also late Pleistocene, early Holocene, social settlement and subsistence systems, so as I say, quite a broad range of interests. Today, George is going to talk to us about the archaeology of human ecology and human ecology of wetlands, ethnographic lessons, theoretical insights, and heritage management strategies. Thanks, George.
Do you want to do the footnotes? Thank you, Mark. What I'm talking about today is something that's quite different from what you may have heard me speak about in previous seminars here, or work that you've encountered by me over the last decade or so, which has dealt with indigenous archaeology, intellectual property issues, archaeological theory, and so on. And in a sense, I'm returning to some basic work that I have been involved with for the last 30 years or so, and that will figure prominently in some of the next research projects that I'm going to be initiating shortly. This being chair is turning out to be a little bit of an encumbrance in terms of the freedom I have with my time. And so I'm looking today at the relationship, the long-term relationship between small-scale societies, particularly what we term hunting and gathering peoples, and a fairly distinct part of the landscape, that is of wetlands. I'm touching on some of my earlier work with rethinking land use on the early post-glacial landscape of the Northeast and other regions. I'm looking at, more generally, the relationship that peoples have with particular kinds of environments, and that relationship changes over time. And then finally, with a really important issue, and that is of representativeness in the archaeological record, both in what we find and how we interpret what we find. And ultimately, what I'm after is, in a sense, an anthropology, and one could add a human ecology of wetlands. And as I'm moving forward with this presentation today, there's three things I want you to keep in mind, or rather, three things that are providing a kind of parameter to this discussion. The first is that I make a distinction, a clear distinction between what I would term wetland sites and wet sites. It is, in a sense, a day and night difference. When we're talking about wetland sites in an archaeological context, we're talking about a relationship that people have with a particular kind of ecozone. When we're talking about wet sites, we're simply talking about the context in which materials may be found. So in other words, a lake bottom is a wet site with high organic preservation, but it's not a wetland. The second point to consider is that we have the opportunity here, and this is very much a part of my work, to look at human environmental interactions at 4 different scales, relative to short and long-term time and local versus regional space. And as you can see here, each of these cells gives us a different view of the past, both locally and long-term, or locally and short-term, and so on. And these different perspectives allow us to learn different things about people's lives in the past, about large-scale associations, and so on. The third point is that although I touch on ethnographic information, and ethnographic information has been used and is very valuable to archaeology, we always need to look at it cautiously because of the potential historical biases that may skew how we use what it is that we take from ethnographic approaches. And my approach here is very much encapsulated in Martin Book's statement. Martin was a committee member on my PhD committee, and as one of the most formidable theorists in the universe, he scared the dickens out of me. Something that I like to pass on to all of my grad students.
Very generous.
So I've organized this presentation around 5 general themes. The first is sort of a, look what we can learn from wetlands over, the long term. The second is a little bit about wetland ecology, then turning to some specific archaeological and ethnographic examples of wetland associations with hunting and gathering peoples, then on to some of the more surprising, or at least unexpected, things that we might find when we start taking a serious look at wetland environments, and then on to heritage management concerns. This last point is relatively short today, but is a direction that I'm now moving in. And then finally, and very briefly, talking about future research questions. And note the asterisk, because that is something that will take you by surprise, literally. So let's look at the association that people in general have had with wetlands. It's a very long, long history. Stretching back to the African savanna and the emerging story of humankind there. We can look at Homo erectus. We can also look at indications of diet that may be incorporating wetland-related flora and fauna. We look cautiously at this time period, trying to avoid making any overgeneralizations. And we also need to recognize that while a wetland-rich environment, often part of a mosaic of different kinds of landscapes, including lakes and ponds and dryland areas, was often a very productive area. It was also too fraught with danger. Dangers big and small, fast and slow. This might be, one of the reasons why we find, those Homo erectus and other skeletons. We can also look at Neanderthals, places like Coombe where there are indications of use of wetland fauna and flora. We find duck remains, as well as cattail pollen and other indicators of wetland-associated flora. Whether these are being used for utilitarian purposes, for food, for insulation, for other purposes, it's all conjecture right now, but there is an association that's intriguing. Coming closer to the present, 11,000 years ago, we find Mesolithic sites throughout Europe, often associated to some degree with wetland environments, including Starkar, one of the most famous European sites, one that is clearly associated with lake and, at times, wetland environments, excavated by Graham Clark, famous for its rich organic preservation. This is also a very intriguing site because over the decades it has been interpreted in a number of different ways by different archaeologists. Examples of well-preserved bone artifacts, but perhaps the most intriguing of all is this red antler frontlet that has been fashioned with a series of holes and which may have been used, as some have proposed, as a shamanic headdress. And here's a lithograph of a Siberian shaman during, I think, the 17th century. There are locations, as we see with the Vermilion Lakes in Alberta, that are rich in wetlands and that have been utilized, based on the archaeological record, for 10, 11,000 years of intermittent utilization. The same thing in other parts of the world, places like Wari Swamp in South Australia, rich organic preservation that includes the first boomerang known, dating to about 10,000 years ago. And this is one of the neat things about wetland sites, is that they do often provide the opportunity to provide these unseen aspects of people's lives, including this. Throughout Europe, there are these so-called trackways, constructions of timber across boggy areas, making it possible for people to traverse them. And what these indicate is the actual pathway through space that people use at particular times. Something that's very rare to get at. We find all these settlements or activity areas or resource areas for procurement, but we can't really draw lines between them, whereas with trackways we do have that opportunity. And also these other dimensions of people's lives, whether they be religious, some Neolithic wooden figurines that are associated with trackways found on the side of trackways, or basketry, in this case from Kitty Burdick's work here in the Northwest Coast. So these are all part of that missing dimension of dryland archaeology. And we also occasionally find the makers. And one of the most famous faces, literally, to peer at us from the past is that of Tolenman, Denmark. The preservation of this individual is simply astounding. And the point here is that wetlands provide us not only with the opportunity to look at particular dimensions of people's lives in the past, and there are likely activities here that were part of an annual range of what people were doing that are not found in any other place on the cultural geography of that people. So in other words, wetlands were often used for very special purposes, whether for religious purposes or for particular kinds of resource extraction, or for protection in some cases. But we also have the opportunity to find really important, from a scientific and other perspective, the makers of these artifacts themselves. And we have two options for this. One is within recently deglaciated areas. We have Puente d'Encinci in far northern BC. We have Utsi in the Alps. And we have the bog people of northwestern Europe. In Florida, we have preserved human brains. And so there's many other examples here to pay attention to. In terms of the ecology of wetlands, what's important to recognize is that there is a huge variety of wetland types. They're found basically all around the world, on virtually every continent. Some are very low in productivity because they are single species rich, but in general they tend to be very productive in three basic ways, or rather three important to humans in three basic ways. And the first is a high productivity. If we look at primary productivity, this is the amount of biomass produced in a particular area per unit of time. We see that wetlands rank almost highest of all major ecozones. The one area that equals them is tropical rainforests. But there the problem is, at least from human perspectives, that most of the fauna of interest to people is up there in the canopy. Hard to get at, dangerous to procure. But we look at tropical rainforests, freshwater wetlands, salt marshes as having greater productivity than grasslands, greater productivity than cultivated fields. Secondly, high resource diversity. There is a huge range of birds and animals and what have you that either live in wetlands or more often utilize wetlands as part of their life cycle. Perhaps one of the more ubiquitous indications or inhabitants of wetlands are beavers. Beavers are intriguing in an ecological sense because beavers produce wetlands and change other parts of the landscape. And if we're looking at people hunting beavers in the past, if you hunt more beavers, you are changing the ecology by removing beavers who are making dams, creating wetlands, and the reverse, producing equally significant changes on the landscape. One thing to keep in mind too, if you look back to the late Pleistocene, this cute little critter had a bigger ancestor, and that was the giant Pleistocene beaver that would have been basically as tall as me. And if you happen to have a wooden leg, I would ask you to run quickly. And then the third key feature here is high resource reliability. That wetlands tend to hold water longer than any other part of the landscape, particularly during droughts, so that they are a reliable source, not only of water, but are utilized longer in times of drought and so on than by animals and than other ecozones. But we also have reliability showing up in the trackways of the flyways of migratory birds. So this is a way to organize your resource procurement, because at certain times of the year you have certain resources that are going to be present. Let me turn to some archaeological and ethnographic examples of what we can see when we look at how people are utilizing wetlands. And the first of these is, I'm speaking of a couple of examples here. I've already mentioned Vermilion Lakes. I'll be talking in a bit about Robin Swamp and Calusa. Windover is where you find preserved human brains, and a number of other sites that I'll be mentioning. But I want to turn first to the Great Basin area, which is down here. And if you know anything about the Great Basin today, you look at it as fairly dry and desolate. But ethnographically, we know that, well, first of all, there are wetlands there during the late Holocene, but also that they were and still are utilized by Native Americans there. The Paiute, for example, this is an ethnographic map of different Paiute groups in the early 20th century. And this is basically what they associate themselves, how they name themselves relative to key food types. The ground squirrel eaters, the quiqui eaters, the quiquis are kind of fish, the cattail eaters, in and around the Stillwater Marsh area. And this is a historic photograph of Wesley George coming back with her husband with a load of tule. Nearby is Hidden Cave, and this is looking out at Hidden Cave at what is that proverbial dry and desolate landscape that would have been rich in wetlands during the mid and early Holocene. And found inside of Hidden Cave was a series of these tule reed duck decoys. And they are, of course, well made, and you say, yes, they do look like ducks. But would a real duck be fooled by that? Well, this is only the frame, because at other nearby sites, we find the complete decoy. And this is covered with a pulled off skin and feathers of the actual duck. And you can't get more lifelike than this. So these are cached in places like Hidden Cave where they were used for duck hunting seasonally. In Stillwater Marsh, this is what it looks like today. And surrounding areas like this, of open water and marshy areas, is evidence of habitation or utilization, including these features. This is about 1 meter across. There's a camera lens cap there for scale. And this was a kind of resource procurement area. So these areas are being consistently and sometimes very heavily utilized. And what we also find from human skeletal remains in this area, looking at indicators of osteoarthritis, is significant differences between males and females, which indicates that males are far more mobile, going greater distances and up slopes, putting strain on their joints, than the females who seem to be staying closer to camp. So we have the opportunity to look at how people are utilizing wetland or other areas relative to degree of mobility and where they may be going for certain types of resources. There is also a rich array of ethnographic and contemporary information on how indigenous peoples, in this case First Nations peoples from British Columbia, have utilized and are utilizing wetland resources. So you have skunk cabbage and slowgrass and reed canary, water parsnip, and so on. Some of these are food uses, some of these are medicinal uses, and so on. Some plants, whether it's tule or typha, that is cattail, are very heavily used. They are sort of the mainstay, the broad utilitarian purposes. What is interesting about cattail also is that it's edible at different times of the year. So in the spring you have the new shoots that you can eat. In the winter you grab the tubers. In the summer you can harvest the cattail pollen, which can be dried and stored. We find ethnographic examples of tule and cattail use in wigwam and mat covers all over North America. And here's an example from the interior plateau. This is historic Secwepemc mat lodge. And one thing to think about is, what is the impact of tule harvesting? Or you can turn this around and for a lodge like this, how much tule do you need to harvest? And we can work this out. We can start to look at the economics of, not only the economics of tule harvesting, but also the impact of such harvesting on the landscape. And how resilient are these reed beds? What kind of impact are people making if they are consistently harvesting significant amounts? We can look at the nutritional value of some of the major and minor wetland plants that we know are being used. Wapato is a highly favored food. In fact, John knows much about Wapato in the lower mainland area through his work with Terry Spurgeon some years ago. And so we could just go down the list. We have extensive information on these nutritional values and so on. But we could also look at caloric values relative to procurement time, to harvest time, to preparation time. This is coming out of Bob Kelly's The Foraging Spectrum, where he lays out post-encounter resource return rates for many different regions, and this is for the Great Basin, where you have the food type, or rather the species, what is being harvested, and the return rate, kilocalories per hour. And if we look at cattail pollen that I mentioned earlier, it is the highest rated value, food value, for the energy expended in procuring it. And this is valuable to know in terms of helping us to understand how people are making their food selection. So that's a little bit about wetland ecological values. Turning now to what I find one of the most interesting things about wetlands, and that is they are giving us an opportunity to challenge some basic assumptions that we may have about people in the past, particularly hunting and gathering peoples, about who we know so much or think we know so much about. And of course, the notion of what constitutes hunting and gathering has changed over time. In the mid-1960s, Henry DeVore and Richard Lee held the seminal Man the Hunter Conference, which produced the Man the Hunter volume. And out of the discussions that took place in that event between archaeologists, ethnographers, and others, what emerged was this so-called generalized hunting and gathering model, where we look at high mobility, egalitarian, economy based on reciprocity, low birth rate, low population density, limited mature culture. I mean, all the stuff that you should already be familiar with. And then you have Martin Most sort of tapping you on the shoulder. Says, well, let's think carefully about this, because that generalized hunting and gathering model is based on the survivors. If you look at the distribution of hunting and gathering peoples before the advent of horticulture, they occupied everywhere in the world in one variety or another. I mean, there's many different types of what we would refer to as hunting and gathering peoples. And yet, with the advent of horticulture, you have horticulturalists emerging out of hunting and gathering, taking over the areas most conducive to horticulture. And by the ethnographic period, where do we find the hunter-gatherers? The Australian outback, the Arctic and subarctic, places that are not conducive to farming. But we then have to think about, well, what did hunting and gathering societies look like when they occupied the most attractive places, not the most marginal places? And that was really one of the key points underlying my PhD dissertation research. So here are some things that we can look at when we focus on wetlands. And here I've included a note or a statement from Lou Binford from correspondence years ago, where he says, in the study of human lifeways, wetlands always appear as exceptional cases. And this is something that has been borne out in everything that I've learned about people and wetlands. But here we have the opportunity to look at the early post-glacial landscape in a different way, to consider opportunities for increased population density or larger settlements or evidence of resource management and so on. And so I want to look briefly at some examples of this. And the first goes back to, as I alluded to, my PhD research titled The Archaeology of Early Place. Clearly an homage to Louis Binford's The Archaeology of Place. I was very much influenced by Binford in my foolish youth, but I still hold strongly to much of the work that he did. And I'll just give you the top layer of this deep story, but working in New England at the time, I became aware of what are known as glacial lakes that dominated much of the early post-glacial landscape, the late glacial landscape. And rather than looking at these as desolate places, I began to consider them as where so-called mosaics, rich in wetland and other kinds of ecozones, would emerge and actually be relatively attractive or productive places in the early landscape. So this is the Rock and Swamp area in northwest Connecticut, southwestern Massachusetts. This is looking out at part of the Main Basin. And within a relatively small area, you have a rich array of different kinds of dry and wet ecozones. And it's fairly easy to look at the modern configuration of Robin Swamp and many other wetlands just based on the current vegetation. But one thing I turned to in my work was hydric soils. And these are distinct classes of soils that are associated with wetland conditions. And so we can find hydric soils. And this shows you, this part of Robin Swamp, the dark stippling shows you, the modern wetlands that we can identify today on the basis of vegetation. And the gray area shows you hydric soils. So in other words, what the hydric soils are showing you is what we've been saying, the early post-glacial extent of that wetland. And this provides opportunities to survey around previous wetlands, such as here and here and here, that today have no clear wetland association. Doing systematic survey in this area for a number of years, we found an astounding number of archaeological sites. It seemed everywhere you threw a shovel or every cornfield you walked, you would find sites. And altogether, we found probably 40 Paleo-Indian and early archaic sites. This is a remarkable number, far exceeding general expectations of the models that were popular at the time. Here you have an array of Paleo-Indian artifacts on the top, early archaic artifacts, including hard-away stemmed points that are normally found only in the southeast. And what we're finding at this location and other former glacial lakes and wetland basins in the northeast is basically representations of all of the known diagnostic artifacts. Okay, and here you see some of the early sites that are associated. And what we find is there tends to be often clustering. One way that I've looked at that is as a kind of recurrence in use of this area. So in other words, people seem to be coming back to this area time and time again over centuries or decades. Lots of mid and late Holocene artifact types. And if we plot all the diagnostics, we see that we have a significant number of early sites that tends to drop off, whether that's an abandonment of the area or lack of visibility or diagnostics. And then a huge number of sites of the middle to late Holocene. And how I've interpreted this is through a concept that I've developed called the ecological leveling. And if we look at the early post-glacial landscape, glacial lake basins rich in wetlands seem to have been the most attractive place on the northeastern landscape because the coast is still recovering from isostatic rebound. The interior riverine areas are still coming into being. And so we're finding throughout the northeast, these areas are being very heavily utilized. What I see going on in the later Holocene is the increase in the occupation of these other zones. And by ecological leveling, what I mean is that the productivity of the glacial lake basins and wetlands is not decreasing, but the ecological values of these other areas are increasing, so that by the mid to late Holocene, places like Robin Swamp are no longer special on the overall landscape. They're simply one of a number of different areas, and I see then that Robin Swamp is being used in a more specific, seasonally oriented way. People are going in to, say, hunt beavers or do particular things. Turning to other examples of some of the special things we find with wetlands, looking at examples of resource management and landscape modification, we can go back to Cook Swamp in Highland, New Guinea, and we have intentional manipulation of parts of the landscape by about 10,000 years ago. We have taro cultivation about 10,000, banana cultivation about 7,000 years ago. So people are getting up to some interesting things long before they're supposed to. There's a lot of other interesting things going on in South Australia. Places like MacArthur Creek in the southeast, you have earthen mounds being constructed in wetland-rich areas. These may be only a meter or so high, but they are giving you dry land in an otherwise often wet environment. And often these are clustered, likely used for hunting activities. And we do, in fact, have some ethnographic insights into their construction and use. In this case, with a grass shelter on top of one. At the Tallulah Wetlands, also in Victoria, there is evidence of canal construction between wetlands or other water bodies, whether to drain them or whether to expedite such things as eeling, as we find in the Mount Eccles region. And there's some really interesting things. This is coming out of some work early on by Heather Gwilth. I had a chance to visit her. And she showed me some of these stone structures that seem to be something more than hunting blinds, but possibly habitation areas, as well as eeling canals or channels. This is partially infilled, but the people in this area were eel harvesters, and they had a series of small ponds that they used to basically drive eels into for long-term storage. So it's a very clever kind of resource management that also includes landscape modification. Some examples of social and political organization, a little bit out of the ordinary. What we are finding in southwestern Australia and some other locations around the world is the environment is able to support significant numbers of people with fairly small tribal areas. In other words, people are packing themselves in within, say, a lot of tribal areas, tribal territories that are really abutting each other. And this is what you find out with southeastern Australia. This is a fairly packed neighborhood of distinct, different social or political groups. And in Runka Flat in South Australia, a riverine area with extensive wetlands nearby, and here's an archaeological feature in front of you. We have some evidence of what can be considered social differences. You have this one individual out of all of the individuals buried at this area, dated to about 7,000 years ago, with a headdress or headband of 160 or so wallaby teeth, as well as buried with a number of other items of personal or group significance. In wetland-rich areas, we also find cities before horticulture. A very famous example being Chatham Island. In North America, we find mound builders before horticulture, such as at Poverty Point. Knowing the nature of the landscape around Cahokia, the most impressive location in North America, we find that it's an array of riverine areas and wetland areas that were capable of supporting very large populations. And in Florida, the Calusa sedentary hunter-gatherers, very rich material culture. So there's a lot of really neat stuff going on. And coming back to Binford's statement earlier, that hunter-gatherers are not supposed to be doing this. So the last key topic I want to touch on now is wetland heritage management. And there is a thriving community of wetland researchers, wetland restoration folks, and wetland ecologists and so on. Wetland restoration has a really important goal, that is to either preserve or to actually produce more wetlands, and that is commendable given the important ecological role that these have in the overall health of the landscape. But these initiatives can cause significant damage to archaeological sites. A couple of weeks ago, I gave a talk to the BC Wildlife Federation's Wetland Institute. And this is part of what I think will be a long-term initiative with them. I'm planning to produce a guide to wetlands heritage protection for folks working in wetlands, focusing on these two questions of why are wetlands important to heritage management. I think all of us can appreciate that now if you hadn't already. And that for folks working in and around wetlands, what do they need to know relative to the potential impact of their work? And I'll come back to that in a moment, but I just want to give you 4 examples of wetland cultural heritage sites in British Columbia that exemplify the range of what we can find both here and in the interior. With 3 of these being heritage management projects of different kinds. The first is Bird's Bog, which is fairly close by. And about 15 years ago, I did a pilot project on the Nottingham farm, doing survey and testing. And we do find fairly extensive but relatively light scatter of culture materials in and around the wetland margins, including such artifacts as this antler foreshaft that had within it a nephrite adze blade. So this is the stuff we love to get, because not just here's the here's the stone tool, but here's part of the rest of what goes with it. Slate knives, lots of debitage, and so on. In Pitt Meadows, we have one of the best known sites in the Lower Mainland these days, the HRP 52. And this was a site excavated by the KC Development Corporation's Archaeology Division that has both a wet and a dry component to it. And many of our students and SFU associates were involved with this project. One of the most intriguing aspects of this is what appears to be cultivation of Wapato, where you have this rock pavement from which 3,500-year-old Wapato tubers were recovered. And this is the earliest evidence of Wapato harvesting, not just harvesting, but really cultivation that we have in the Northwest Coast. Associated with this pavement was digging stick tips. Another example, this is work that I did in Saviston Lake. There's Cowlings Lake, if you need to get oriented, in the Thompson River. This is an upland location. This is the kind of location that Secwepemc peoples and their predecessors were likely using on a seasonal basis for hunting or resource extraction. And a variety of tools and debitage found associated with the margins. And then final example at Schlesses, which is Chatham Island, located off the southern tip of Vancouver Island. This is a western wetland restoration project that was the master's thesis of my son Graham. And he was concerned with developing a restoration plan for the wetlands here, based not on ecological values, because the question that always comes up is, to what condition, to what time period are you restoring the wetland to? His restoration plan was based on information he had from the last Songhees person to live on the island, Joan Morris. There are clear indications of use of this island in terms of CMTs and lithics and so on. But talking to Joan Morris, she revealed that this was a sacred pond, a bathing area associated with this wetland. So this became the target for his restoration plan. And so it's an example of shifting such kind of thinking from restoring it to ecological values to restoring it to ecological values coupled with heritage values of the people whose territory, whose history is represented here. So getting back to what wetland managers and wetland restoration experts need to know, it's very much of what I've been conveying you to today in terms of the rich legacy of utilization of wetlands going back as far as we can go. The likelihood of cultural remains being associated around and also within wetlands, including human remains. The opportunities we have for ecological and paleoecological data collection, the awareness we need to share that fluctuations in the water table can wreak havoc upon organic artifacts. They will quickly deteriorate rather than if they are in stable condition. And finally, that local communities, First Nations or otherwise, need to be involved in meaningful ways in sharing information about their use, past and present, but also in making decisions about the future of such places. And then finally, wetland restoration can restore wetland values as an ecozone, but it can also destroy heritage values which are finite and irreplaceable. So let me finish up with this, future research directions. And there's an asterisk again. Josh, you do the honors. What I'm doing here is an example of crowdsourcing. That I've talked to you about much of the work that I've done over the last 2 or 3 decades related to wetlands. And what I want to do now is to take advantage of your varied perspectives coming from all different realms of archaeology to give me one thing that strikes you about, gee, here's something I'd really like to know about wetlands, or here's something I think that you should take on as part of your new wetland research agenda. So just give me a quick statement. And this is a reminder too, as John Private pointed out a week or so ago, that this is an archaeology seminar with a course number associated with it. And it's our expectation that you are here every week to learn from all of you, your learning colleagues and guest visitors, different aspects of archaeology. So take a minute to quickly fill that out. And feel free to just shout out to the crowd what your idea is, what your question is. This may or may not earn you co-authorship in subsequent publications, but you will be credited one way or another if I pursue this.
My recommendation is for you to get back to work as a department chair. Quit fooling around with this wetland stuff.
Oh, this is my 1 hour break in the month, John. Don't deny me this.
Here's my suggestion. Develop a recommended practice policy for addressing cultural heritage values as part of all ecological restoration projects affecting wetlands.
Good. Anyone else? I'll take pleasure in reading these later on. If you want to delve back into some of my earlier work, here's a set of citations. But basically, I just want to close up by asking if you have any questions. Yes?
For the ecological What was your evidence that showed that? Was it archaeological evidence or geological?
We can look at it archaeologically, but what I'm trying to do is explain the pattern that I see in the increase in the archaeological record at certain time periods. But if you look at the paleoecological record, if you look at the pollen cores, it becomes evident that the coastal areas, the riverine areas, stabilize. The anadromous fish are, making up the rivers. You are having other resources, other forest types, other vegetation types are establishing themselves and becoming more and more productive.
Okay, so it's like coring.
Coring amongst other things, yeah.
No problem.
George, what's in a salt marsh that makes it so productive relative to all other ecosystems?
I really don't know. And it's important to point out when we're talking about primary productivity, we're simply talking about how much vegetation there is. And so I don't know, anything, or at least can't remember anything about, salt marsh, flora and why it's distinct or why it's so productive. But what's important from a human ecological perspective is more plants or more whatever you have, the more animals, the more whatever you have, utilizing those. So more grasses, more ungulates, more deer on the dinner table kind of equation. Okay, well, I look forward to reading your new research directions for me. I'll let you guys be the puppet master and direct my research for the next 10 years.
Very interesting approach.
Thank you.